Good morning. My name is Scott Kowalski with the law firm of Petty Livingston Dawson Richards here in Lynchburg, and I am the vice chairman of the Government Relations Committee for the Lynchburg Regional Business Alliance. And on behalf of the Business Alliance and our almost 800 members and their 43,000 plus employees, we welcome you to our 2020 Federal Candidate Forum. The Alliance proudly represents the counties of Amherst, Appomattox, Bedford, and Campbell, and the towns of Alta Vista, Amherst, Appomattox, Bedford, and Brookneal, as well as the city of Lynchburg. Day in and day out, the Alliance works to promote the regional economic growth and enhance the lives and quality of life of all the residents in the greater Lynchburg region. At this time of year, however, we would like to encourage our members and everyone in the region to participate in the electoral process, which begins with learning about the candidates running for election or re-election and how they feel on the issues of importance to the Alliance. And of course, we encourage everyone to show up in November at the polls and cast their ballot for the candidates of their choice. Today, we are delighted to have the opportunity to interview Dr. Cameron Webb, candidate for the 5th District House of Representatives, and to hear from him why he's running for office and what his positions are on issues of importance to the Alliance, including congressional activity during the COVID-19 pandemic, the state of manufacturing, the state of higher education and funding, and the condition of U.S.-China relations. Ultimately, each interviewee is encouraged to explain to viewers why he should earn your vote. Welcome, Dr. Webb, to our interview. Before we begin our questions and getting your responses, let's get started by hearing a little bit about you, your background, and why you're running for office.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me this morning. Again, I'm Cameron Webb, and the top line on me is that I'm a doctor, an internal medicine doctor. I'm a lawyer, and I'm a professor at the University of Virginia. And so, typically in my work, I work in the hospital taking care of patients. Since March, I've been working on the coronavirus unit at the University of Virginia, taking care of COVID patients. In my work as a lawyer and professor, I'm the director of health policy and equity at the UVA School of Medicine, and I've been doing that work for some time. But in truth, that tells what I do. Who I am is I'm a kid from Spotsylvania County, Virginia. Grew up there, and I'm passionate about kind of the needs and concerns of this particular district. My wife is from Appomattox County, and we came back here. We came back home after our training in medicine and law to make sure we were able to serve our communities. And I think that's the big motivation. Service has been a big part of my life, my entire life. My mom is a public school teacher for 31 years now. My father worked in law enforcement for 20 years for the Drug Enforcement Administration. In addition, he not only helped hire all the DEA agents, but also helped design their training programs and protocols. So it's really important to me that service is at the center of anything and everything that I do. That's how I got into medicine, and that's ultimately what landed me in the White House. And I worked in the White House from 2016 into 2017. And pretty uniquely, I served both in the Obama and Trump administrations, because to me, it's not about partisan politics. It's about the people on the other end of it. It's about making sure that we're in a position to put people over those politics and focus on their needs and concerns. And so I worked on the White House healthcare team for President Obama. And also I worked on the Domestic Policy Council healthcare team for President Trump. I worked on, building and executing the Affordable Care Act for President Obama. And I worked on reducing the cost of prescription drugs for President Trump. These experiences taught me a lot about how, even though sometimes it seems like our politics are irreconcilable, the truth is there's a lot of commonality. There are a lot of areas where we can build consensus and work together. And that's what I aim to do. I decided to run for Congress just because I knew how important it was in this moment that we do turn toward each other, turn toward unity, really decry the division that we're seeing all over our society and say, how can we move forward together, move forward on our economy and make sure that everybody has access to good paying jobs, move forward on healthcare to make sure everyone has access to affordable care, and move forward on crises like climate change and even criminal justice reform, things that are absolutely vexing our communities all over the Commonwealth and certainly all over the 5th Congressional District. Now, this district is diverse, it's broad. I think there are a lot of skill sets that can be useful and a lot of perspectives that are valuable in representing this district. But to me, it comes down to one simple premise, that idea that the most important thing that any legislator, any representative can do from a district this diverse, this broad, is to be a good listener. And as a doctor, my skill set is to walk into rooms, ask people where it hurts, and listen for their answer and work together to find a solution. So I look forward to talking with you all this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. All right, the first category we're going to hit this morning is congressional activity during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the first few months of the pandemic, Congress authorized roughly $3 trillion in coronavirus relief in 4 separate measures. These bills attempt to protect the American economy from the long-term impacts caused by the stay-at-home orders and overall response to the virus. These packages included billions of dollars in aid for testing, education, small business relief, corporate relief, and local and state and government assistance. First question on this topic, Dr. Webb, what is your assessment of the effectiveness of these relief packages thus far?
Well, I start off by saying my vantage point on this is as a practicing clinician. I mentioned that I work in the special pathogens unit, or the COVID unit at the University of Virginia. So I've seen up close and personal the impact of this pandemic on the patients that I care for. And then also in my role, as a candidate, I've gone all across the 5th congressional district, all 21 counties, both cities, hearing from individuals. I actually just completed a small business tour over in several of our counties. And what we found all across the board was that the individuals are struggling. There was the PPP funding initially that was very helpful, but at the end of the day, it doesn't get the job done into the winter. It was meant to last and be a bridge for some period of time. So that funding was helpful by most measures from the small business owners that I've talked to. But even still, it's not a panacea. We have to keep going. We have to keep supporting these individuals. We have an increase in cases coming our way. Federal response, in terms of my assessment of it, I think that we could have done a better job with testing on the front end. I think that the lag in getting meaningful testing out in all of our communities caused some real problems. And I say that as a clinician. But I do think that we have opportunities to overcome that now. We still, it's not too late for us to make sure that we get those practices in place. We have to make sure that we have the personal protective equipment, and that's going to enable our kids to get back into schools. You see that I'm calling you from home right now, and it's because my kids are in virtual school, and my wife and I have to work together to get them set up. That's why the sun's beaming on my face right now. So I think it's so important that we recognize everybody is feeling the impact of this pandemic in different ways. We're all in this together. And I think it's so critical for our legislators to make sure that they're getting the job done. So the CARES Act was an important first step. It's important that, yes, the Senate Republicans supported that as well. That President Trump supported that as well. And that everybody recognized we need to do that work. Even the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has said that we have to continue to spend to support Americans through this crisis. And so even though I know my opponent has mentioned that he wouldn't have supported the original CARES Act funding, it's been an absolute necessity for our communities to navigate this crisis. And so that's why, from my perspective, we need to continue to think about the moment that we're in and what's going to serve the long-term needs of the American people. This isn't necessarily a moment for austerity. It's a moment for making the right decision to continue to serve the American people. And I think that we're going to have to do that. But now this COVID pandemic, it is what's important to also keep in mind is that it's exposed a lot of the inequities across our society. So inequities in rural broadband and also in our education system, that digital divide, inequities in our healthcare system. So we have to keep our eye on how it's impacting everybody. And that's how we'll be able to make sure we make the right moves moving forward.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. I understand your position that we need to continue the funding, but considering the impact on the deficit and debt that these massive spending measures are placing, what can Washington do to avoid having to continue issuing such large relief packages in the future?
Oh, I completely agree that the deficit is concerning. We just had reports that the deficit this year is going to be one of the largest in recent history for sure. And so I think that that's going to be important for us to make sure that we get the steps right on the front end. The key to the navigating a public health crisis, a pandemic, is going to be having the testing protocols in place, having the ability to identify and isolate, and to contact trace. And we still haven't stood that up in sufficient measure to make sure that we're serving all of our communities well. So the testing capacity, we continue to need that. And I think we continue to really need to focus in on it in order to get this right. That's the first step. If we do that well, then we'll be okay.
Thank you. Now we're going to move on to a different topic, the state of U.S. manufacturing. One of the few positive developments during the pandemic has been a renewed interest in seeing more overseas manufacturing return to the United States. First question on this topic. You agree that certain manufacturing sectors should be encouraged to return to the United States, including the production of pharmaceuticals, health and safety products, including personal protective equipment that you mentioned, and the domestic manufacture of equipment for the electrical grid.
Absolutely. I think that it's so important that we get businesses back here. The idea of buying Americans has been so important all along. It's a key part of our economy. I think that when I worked on the drug pricing task force for President Trump, that's something we talked about a lot. How do we ensure that as one of the last pharmaceutical developers, one of the last creators, so to speak, in that space, that we have to continue to do that work. And so that's going to be one of the key priorities, is make sure that we bring back businesses just like that. I think the USMCA was a step in the right direction for that, right? It helped us to make sure that we're creating the conditions where manufacturers have opportunities to come back. But I think that we have to continue to keep the pressure on, particularly with folks like China, where some of their practices are making it hard to be competitive globally, to keep manufacturing jobs in places like the United States. So it is so important for us to make sure that we're seeing the whole field, we're seeing all the conditions that are leading to manufacturers leaving the United States, and creating conditions that are right for manufacturers to return. And I think that's going to be one of the keys for us moving forward. I think that we have it's a clarion call. We need the jobs. We know that that's going to be important for our communities, for our society. And here in the 5th Congressional District, manufacturing has been a key part of the identity of the 5th District for so long. You know, if you go back to the textile mills like Dan River Mills, or even the Thomasville factory in Appomattox County, those were large employers that really helped support entire communities. And losing those manufacturing jobs has had an impact. And we're not necessarily going to outright replace those manufacturing jobs. But I do think that what we're going to do is complement that with some of the other jobs that we want to bring back. Our clean economy is going to create new jobs. If we're talking about solar, we're talking about hydro and wind, we're talking about how that's less expensive than fossil fuel technologies on the free market. And so it's important for us to keep that in mind and say, hey, there are also new jobs that are going to be really important for us to complement, while also bringing back manufacturing jobs.
Right, thank you. Now, along the lines of wanting those jobs to come back, what legislation or incentives would you support or propose in order to bring those manufacturing jobs back from overseas?
I think it's about having standards. So no matter where our manufacturers are going, it's about making sure that they've got the standards in place so that they're able to say, yes, manufacturing in China is not going to be more advantageous to us just because they're skirting human rights violations, right? We want to make sure that our trade agreements make sure that in every instance, there's a similar set of circumstances for folks to rely on, and for businesses to make their decisions based on. And certainly there can be tax incentives. I think this is where, like I said, the framework of the USMCA was very successful. And remember, that was bipartisan legislation. That was legislation where we all recognized that, hey, this serves Americans well. And some folks say it didn't do quite enough to bring more manufacturing back to the United States. So I think that that's us moving in the right direction. It's using our trade agreements and make sure that we're leveraging those to create conditions where businesses find, being present in the United States as being a net benefit rather than a harm to them.
Great, thank you. Now we're going to move on to something you just mentioned a couple times in your answer there. It's the state of U.S.-China relations. Even before the outbreak of the pandemic, the state of U.S.-China trade relations has been volatile, if not bitter. COVID-19 has certainly complicated those relations. Both countries have imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of each other's goods. So the first question on U.S.-China relations is, what is your position on allowing Chinese government-controlled or directed corporations to invest in certain critical sectors of the U.S. economy, including infrastructure and information technologies? And if you want to hit on Huawei as a specific one, please do so.
Absolutely. Well, I think this one thing that we've noticed in the past is that our concerns are really around the lack of consistency in Chinese corporations and their relationships with the Chinese government or with the CCP. I think that the concerns are always going to be the national security and the well-being of the American people. And I think that in the absence of being able to secure those things, it's critical for the American government to say, what can we do to pull back, to really recognize that these corporations have the potential to do harm right here in the United States. And so I do believe that we have to have really a strong position. You have to be a hawk when it comes to China, I believe. And I think that that's something that, when you talk about what President Trump's intentions are, that's where he had it right. The intention is you have to hold them accountable. You have to be strong with regard to that relationship with China. I think that on the other hand, it's really important for us to recognize we have a lot of partners who feel the same way, and that multilateral agreements are going to be really our key to putting the necessary pressure on China to be good actors, especially when it comes to their actions here in the United States of America. And so those are things that I'm really emphasizing. Those are things that I've talked about, and I've seen it from my own vantage point in healthcare. I've seen it from, certainly in U.S.-China relations. We've seen it in terms of this coronavirus response and the way that the United States has been able to engage with China, or the lack thereof. We've seen it in terms of our opioid crisis with synthetic fentanyl coming into our country, and the lack of an ability to work together with China to make sure we're curbing it. We've seen it in intellectual property abuses here in terms of American technologies that are being stolen. And again, our ability to exert pressure on China is going to be critical. I don't think we should go it alone, though. I think it's going to be really important for us to work together with our allies and make sure that we're all putting that pressure on China to change their practices, to change their oversight, and make sure that we're securing the national security interests of the American people.
Thank you. And speaking of the pressure you were just discussing, question is about tariffs. What is your position on the tariffs that have been imposed, whether they should continue or not? And if you don't like the tariffs or oppose the tariffs, what alternate solutions do you have?
Well, I think the tariffs, when I talk to farmers all over our district, the tariffs have been harmful to folks here in the 5th Congressional District. And so, like I said, the intention behind it was appropriate. The intention behind it was, how do we put pressure on China to act differently in this national stage? But I think the impact of them has really been, it disadvantages American corporations, it disadvantages American agriculture, agribusiness, and that's something that we just can't afford, especially in moments like this. I believe that the more effective approach, like I mentioned before, is going to be through multilateral agreements. Those are going to be the key in working together with our partners. And one thing that we've developed a bad habit of as of late is stepping away from critical tables where we need to sit, whether it's the World Health Organization or whether it's the JCPOA. In a lot of spaces where we should be a leader, we're stepping away and saying, well, we're not going to be in this. That's not who we are as a nation. Who we are is we set the table in so many ways. And I think we need to continue to lean into that. I think that's going to be helpful to us in these conversations with China. When it comes to tariffs, we can set the table with some of our allies and some of our friends and make sure that we're able to exert those pressures on China to make sure that they're, one, addressing human rights violations, but two, creating fair trade practices that allow everybody to compete nationally and then also ultimately favors American business.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. Now we're going to move on to a different topic, higher education. The Lynchburg region is blessed to have several excellent private and public institutions of higher learning. Most funding for colleges and universities comes from state allocations and tuition fees paid by students and parents. First question on this topic. What do you think has been the main cause of the growth in the costs of higher education in the past couple of decades?
I think the growth of the cost of higher education, some of it has to do with the cost of doing business in this space. It's incredibly expensive to make sure that we're keeping up the technology and also the physical space needs of our students. And I think that, yes, it's become more and more expensive locally to provide the level of education that we want to see in the higher ed space. Also, from a competitive standpoint, I think that people are recognizing that when you're going up against private institutions, you have to continue to increase the amount that you're charging in terms of tuition to be able to compete and attract the top students. I think that's the lifeblood of a lot of our colleges and institutions. But as those prices have continued to rise, it's put a college education out of reach for too many people. And I think that's going to ultimately be to our detriment. So I think that that's where we talk about the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act and how we can put some of the pieces in place to make sure that there are resources available for everybody who wants to pursue post-secondary education, whether that's going to be, and I always like to keep in mind, listen, it's not all going to be about a 4-year college. Some individuals are going to be best served with job training, workforce development, or some kind of vocational tech program. Some folks are best served with a 2-year, community college degree. And we've got 6 community colleges that have a presence right here in the 5th Congressional District. And some folks are going to be best served with a 4-year college degree. And I think it's important for us to note all of those are going to be very different, but cost shouldn't be the determinant between them. I think that as costs continue to rise, we shouldn't anticipate that they're going to stop rising. It's like any other sector that's continued to happen over time. But I think that we do have to recognize that we have to put pieces in place so it remains within reach for the majority of Americans.
Thank you. And as a specific follow-up there, what can the federal government or should the federal government do to assist in keeping costs lower or making education more available to the majority of the residents of the district?
Well, and I think it's 2 things. So in terms of keeping the costs lower, I think our federal grants are going to be so important for supporting our colleges and universities. And I think that that's something that we've continued to do with some success in recent years, but we do have to increase the amount of funding that's available federally for our colleges and universities, because the other side of that bargain is making sure that when they keep those prices down, it's more affordable for individuals to access. Our society benefits when individuals are able to access a 4-year college or university education. And so I think that our federal grants that are They're administered through the Department of Education, which has been a critical component of the experience here in the education experience here in America. I think that our grants and our programs there aimed to reduce the cost of college education is going to be so important for us to continue to invest in. And again, you're talking about four-year colleges and universities, but I just want to point out that there are still a lot of challenges in terms of certificate granting programs, not necessarily being able to get that Pell Grant funding that's necessary for folks to access that education. So we want to make sure that everybody has access to post-secondary education. Keep in mind, here in the 5th Congressional District, less than 30% of individuals go on to a four-year college degree. So I do think it's important for us to emphasize four-year college education, but also recognize not everybody's going to take that path forward. And so some of what we're going to see is that, hey, we may be able to inch that up some by making college more accessible from an economic standpoint. But also, we have to make sure that there are still options in place if that other, 71% of individuals, if their focus is on getting a pathway to good paying jobs through some other mechanism, whether it's, like I said, job training, vocational tech, apprenticeship programs, or even community colleges. Those are critical for us to keep in mind, taking a holistic view to post-secondary training.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Webb. Speaking of access and cost increases, we'll move on now to healthcare. First is a fairly broad question, but I'm giving you an opportunity to expound on it. What is your position on healthcare generally, and specifically with the Affordable Care Act? Do you believe it should be left as it is, should be modified in some way, or repealed?
Well, I think healthcare continues to be a challenge here in the United States. Broadly, it's 1/5 of our economy. We spent $3.6 trillion on it.
Lost you there for a minute, Dr. Webb.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And I apologize for that. So what I was saying on healthcare was that, it's a huge problem. It's 1/5 of our economy. We spend $3.6 trillion annually on healthcare. And even with that, it's the largest employer as a sector in the United States. So it's so important for us to get healthcare right. But despite the fact that the Affordable Care Act got 20 million people insurance or 20 million people coverage, we still have over 30 million Americans who don't have coverage. And this coronavirus pandemic has only made things worse. So my stance on healthcare is pretty clear. What I say is that we need to build upon the Affordable Care Act. And that starts with fixing some of those things. We had legislative fixes that we could have made on the front end of this of the Affordable Care Act. But over the last 10 years, we just haven't been able to address some of the simple challenges in the ACA. Things like fixing the so-called family glitch that set insurance subsidies to an individual rather than their entire family and disadvantaged families. Things like the cost sharing reduction subsidies that were eliminated and should be restored. Things like restoring the individual mandate, because we know that that's the key to being able to protect folks with pre-existing conditions. Things like extending our subsidies beyond 400%. Those are all key fixes to the Affordable Care Act that we must make. In addition to recognizing the things that it's done well, protecting folks with pre-existing conditions, like I mentioned, the dependent coverage provision for individuals up to age 26, the provisions that made it possible for women and for older Americans to be able to get access to coverage at the same rates as other individuals. There shouldn't have been a differential there. So by changing the rules, making sure that insurers are playing by a certain set of rules, the ACA has done a lot of good. We have to continue to build on it. I support a public option. So again, you have to have a plan for getting those 30 million Americans covered. I think a public option allows us to do that. And I think that in combination with private insurance, which I support keeping both in place, I think the combination will allow us to get close to making sure that everybody has access to coverage, whether it's through a public plan or private plan. I believe that private insurers have been an innovator in our healthcare system. I think that they've created or provided choice for a lot of Americans. And so I think that those are things we want to preserve, especially in this moment, especially while so many folks are trying to figure out what's next in our American healthcare system. From my perspective, and this is a perspective practicing medicine, really seeing up close and working on health policy, both in the Obama and Trump administrations, I think that the best combination moving forward is a combination of public and private and building on the Affordable Care Act.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. You mentioned the public option in there, and if you could maybe describe that a little more in depth, and then any other modifications of the healthcare system other than the ones you mentioned as a modification to the ACA.
Sure. So in terms of a public option, what I believe is that it should operate on the Affordable Care Act insurance exchanges. Those exchanges are already in place, and they allow individuals to to select a plan that's existing in those marketplaces. But what we know is that in a lot of those marketplaces, just like in the Charlottesville area in 2018, there was only one insurer. And what happened is they ended up charging what were the highest insurance premiums in the entire nation in 2018. So that's not acceptable. I think a public option existing on those marketplaces creates competition with private insurance in those spaces, helps level the playing field and make sure that folks are competing. The other thing is that having competition brings more competition to bear. And so just by virtue of having multiple insurers, you're helping to cost insurers at this point, the majority of our insurance marketplaces don't actually have multiple insurers. They don't have more than two insurers in those ACA marketplaces. So we need to make sure we protect that and build upon that. Now, all that said, I think that it's going to be really important for us to think even beyond that with the public option. It has to preserve access. And to do so, that means that you can't be paying at Medicare rates, because Medicare rates, as one of the lower payers here, is going to be really hard for our rural hospitals. It's so important for us to design this future of access in the American healthcare system with rural hospitals in mind. We've lost 150 rural hospitals since 2010. We've lost 15 in 2020 alone. And so it's so important for us to protect our rural hospitals. That's a key component of access to care. And some of the other tweaks you have to keep in mind is we can propagate telehealth, telemedicine in a new way. I know we're going to talk about rural broadband, especially after my internet just shut out. And so I think it's going to be really important for us to recognize that telehealth is one of our approaches to expanding that access. So I teach an entire semester-long course on this at the University of Virginia. I'd love to cover it all in 3 minutes, but what I want folks to know is that I've worked on this both from the Obama administration perspective and from the Trump administration perspective. I know intimately how different individuals, different ideologies think about these challenges. I know the importance of preserving innovation. I know the importance of making sure everybody has access to care. I know the importance of bringing down the cost of prescription drugs. I know what that means to my patients. I know what it means to our system as a whole. I know that we need long-term care for our older Americans, and that's a huge challenge. And I think that the future of health reform needs to incorporate that as well. And so a lot of different pieces, but I think that Donald Trump said while I was actually in his White House, he said, "Who knew healthcare could be so complicated?" And I always remind folks, you want to have legislators that can step up to this complex system and make sure that they're designing something that's in the best interest of the American people.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Webb. As you indicated, we're going to talk about rural broadband and the need for that as we're experiencing right now. So prior to the pandemic, the Lynchburg region's localities were already working hard to improve broadband service and coverage. COVID-19's impact on healthcare, education, government, and industry makes the need for reliable high-speed internet an essential utility. CARES Act funding has supported state and local governments prioritizing broadband initiatives for telemedicine, telework, and virtual education. So far, what has the federal government done to assist in the implementation of rural broadband wireless, and what do you assess as the effectiveness of those efforts?
Well, the federal government's done a lot, and I've been paying attention to this for quite some time now. I was really intimately engaged or aware of the National Broadband Plan that was issued in 2010, and recognizing we had a strategy and a goal of achieving universal broadband coverage by 2020. And I think we've fallen short of that for a few reasons. The first is that we realized that for our internet service providers, yes, encouraging the private industry to get out there and make sure that everybody has access to broadband is important, but it's not sufficient. The challenge is that in more urban areas, it's easier to make sure everybody's wired. In rural spaces like Pennsylvania County, by geography, the largest county in the Commonwealth of Virginia, it's hard to make sure that every single space has that last mile of connectivity. And that's where your public-private partnerships come in. Now, the Commonwealth of Virginia has done a lot of work in this space with the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative. We have a lot of regional hubs trying to encourage the development of more broadband access. But from the federal perspective, what it looks like is some of the resources through the USDA, the Reconnect program, through the FCC, making sure we're leveraging those dollars, bringing them back to our districts. And that's something that Congressman Riggleman has definitely been focused on, and he worked in a bipartisan fashion with Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger in Virginia's 7th district to try to make sure we're getting some rural broadband dollars back in this space. And I think that's so important for us to recognize this isn't a Democrat problem or Republican problem. We all agree that we should expand rural broadband access. What comes down to are the mechanism and how we get those dollars back to our communities. I think right now we have a really compelling interest, as you mentioned, with challenges in education and healthcare and industry. And I think that aligning those things and saying, hey, we need more assistance, it's going to be important. But what I do is I look to, I think one area we haven't done quite enough from a federal perspective also, in addition to the funding dynamic and really spurring those public-private partnerships, is leveraging the convening power of the United States Congress, really learning best practices from across the country. Because, I've talked with legislators from Minnesota who've done a lot in terms of expanding rural broadband access. They've been one of the leaders nationally. And I say, well, what is it that you're doing in Minnesota that's different than what we're able to do here in the Commonwealth of Virginia? And the truth is, it's just a matter of leveraging all of those different opportunities and doing it well. And so I think that really using that convening power to create kind of a learning environment across the country to make sure that everybody's focused on broadband access, that's going to be really key for us. And I think that it's one of the issues that unites the 5th congressional district from tip to tail, from Fauquier to Fluvanna to Franklin County. Everybody knows that we need better rural broadband access. Cumberland County, 20% of people have broadband access. In Brunswick, it's about 30%. And if you go over to Pittsylvania County, we're talking 50 to 60%. Those numbers just aren't adequate. Our youth are experiencing that up close and personal right now because of the need for virtual school. Our seniors are experiencing that because of concerns about going into hospitals, but instead wanting to do telehealth visits, but not being able to because of a lack of broadband access. So those are all things that we recognize right now that we've got to get right.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Webb. You already hit on my my follow-up question, so we'll move on to another category.
Okay.
Category is restaurants. In addition to being part of the lifeblood of our communities, U.S. restaurants do have over $800 billion of business annually and employ over 15 million workers in 2019. This industry has been severely impacted by the pandemic, perhaps as much as any other industry in the nation. Local and state governments are providing funding and some financial relief and flexibility in offering new dining options. The federal government has provided $120 billion worth of rescue funds, and there are several different pieces of legislation that have been proposed, one by Representative Earl Blumenauer called the Restaurants Act of 2020, and a mirror provision in the Senate by Senator Roger Wicker of Missouri. These nearly identical bills propose $120 billion worth of restaurant revitalization at the Treasury Department, earmarked for grants that would go to independent restaurants. Do you know about this legislation? And if so, do you support it? And if you have any other options for what to do from the federal government's perspective for restaurants and their employees, please expand on that.
I'm somewhat familiar with the legislation, just nominally, though. I think that, the idea that everybody's recognizing how hard restaurants have been hit is really, really important for us to keep in mind. And kind of in the small business tour we've been doing across the district these last few weeks, it's been really important to engage with restaurant owners and realize that no two experiences are the same. So I think that the key to legislation to support our restaurants and that industry is making sure that it's as flexible and as individualized as our restaurants are themselves. Some of them have been able to adapt to the current environment and are doing just fine. Some of them have a lot of different challenges in terms of their inability to do outdoor seating or their inability to ultimately return the same number of staff back. And so I think that making sure that there's flexibility in these programs is going to be the key. My hope is that we're able to do this, within the confines of the next tranche of funding for COVID relief, because I think that it's going to continually need to be re-upped for our restaurant industry by continuing to keep our eye on where things are from one point to point. And so, right now where we are in the fall, restaurants are dealing with the idea of how do we prepare for a winter season when folks can't stay indoors. And I always tell people I'm an evidence-based kind of guy. I follow the research, and we have enough studies that tell us that indoor dining is one of the most likely spaces where individuals are going to catch this virus, where they're going to catch COVID-19 because of just the mechanism of eating indoors, the challenges with ventilation, and the fact that it's a high likelihood space for folks to get the virus. And so it's so important for us to protect folks from that environment and at the same time protect our restaurants. A lot of communities are stepping up and they're supporting restaurants in a lot of other ways. But I think from a federal standpoint, continuing to get resources to our restaurants is going to be a key, because they're a key engine, as you mentioned, in our economy.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. And you once again hit my follow-up question. So we will move on to our final topic of the day, which is transportation and most specifically the airline industry. In late May, the News in Advance indicated that despite a dramatic decline in ridership, As a result of the coronavirus epidemic, the Lynchburg Regional Airport Authority will end with a surplus rather than seeking additional funds and federal aid. They've been awarded more than $6 million as part of the CARES Act, which was, as you mentioned before, a sweeping several trillion-dollar federal rescue package. So the director of the airport has indicated that he will not be seeking on behalf of the airport any additional city funding. What do you assess has been the effectiveness of the initial tranche of funding that went with, I think it was $25 billion to the airline industry, and then whether or not an additional requested tranche of funding for the airline industry should be approved by the federal government?
Well, my understanding of it, and it's interesting to hear exactly how things are playing out in Lynchburg with the regional airport. But we know our airlines have been hard hit. I know that overall their bottom lines have been heavily affected, and the ability for Americans ultimately on the other side of this pandemic, even though we'll never return to life as usual, we are going to get back to traveling. We're going to get back to folks going across the country, and hopefully that happens, in as short an order as is safe and practicable. But I think that what's going to be really important to recognize is that the industry has been hit very hard. And so again, in a completely bipartisan way, you hear both Republicans and Democrats saying our airlines need more support. I think that as an industry, it has been hard hit. Revenues are down. And so while the airports themselves may be doing okay in some instances, it's really the ability of the airlines to remain profitable. And there are a lot of individuals employed in that sector. Travel in general is down, and we need to support that space. And so I do believe that, by all accounts, the next tranche of funding is going to have some resources for our airline industry. We've got to remain invested in that because, again, we don't want to, cut off our eyes to spite our face. This is our ability to get around not just the country, but the world. And right now, that doesn't seem like the top priority just because of the challenges and the fears about traveling for some folks. But I think that, in time, we're going to be hoping that we invested thoughtfully to keep our airline industry afloat and to keep it strong, in particular to keep the American airline industry strong.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. And that's the conclusion of our questioning. I very much appreciate your time today. Now I'd like to give you an opportunity to summarize your positions and present yourself to the LRBA members.
Absolutely. So, I just want to conclude by saying this is such a unique election, such a unique year. You don't often have a dynamic where we have a recession that's driven by a virus. And I think that our ability to navigate this is our ability to lean into expertise where we can find it. And my expertise certainly is in the healthcare space, but it's also in leveraging different offices and agencies across our federal government. It's having worked with 23 federal offices and agencies in my time in the White House closely, and understanding that they all have a role to play in our recovery from this current set of circumstances. And it starts with the public health response, making sure we do that well, making sure that we create safe environments for folks to get out and to engage and to be back in our practicing and engaging in our economy in a meaningful way. That's going to be the key. And I believe that I have an opportunity to help lead in that effort. My expertise, not only being a practicing physician, but working on the front lines with COVID patients is a helpful perspective to bring as we continue to have these conversations. But my passion for consensus building, my passion for working with folks who don't always see things the same way that I do, as evidenced by the 7 months that I spent in the Trump White House. Those are experiences that I think in a moment like this are all the more important. So I just want to thank you all for taking out time to hear from me. I clearly, for me, the economy is a huge issue. I think that we have to continue to work to support our economy, particularly in a lot of our rural communities. And that's going to play out through rural broadband, through investing in K-12 education, job training, workforce development, vocational tech programs, our community colleges. Those are the keys to creating good paying jobs. We also have to invest in healthcare. We also have to invest in the economy of the future, which includes a clean economy. That's the message I've had since my primary election on the Democratic side. That's the message I will continue to have if I have the opportunity to serve this district in the United States Congress. It's one of unity, it's one of consensus building, it's one of thoughtfulness, it's one of being evidence-based, following the numbers, and doing what's right for the people. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope to have your support.
All right, thank you, Dr. Webb, for your time today.